This is part 3 of Martin Heidegger's Building, Dwelling, Thinking. And this comes after the interlude, where I try to address a little more thoroughly the questions of the exterior of language and consciousness. And in this particular reading, we're focusing on the figure of the bridge in Heidegger's text and the concept of the locale. There is some thinking about the use of habitus in Heidegger, what he actually means by that. Is it a type of passage? Recapping a bit on the second reading. And we're also made aware of some kind of special relation then, which moves dwelling into our conscious thought. And for that, I had brought up a perturbance of shaping, shaping in the way that Stevens might see it. And it's not the shape, but it's constancy. Now, Heidegger will, in his discussion of the bridge as thing, also move into constancy. And constancy is, in this particular reading, what kind of foregrounding or questions I'm bringing, constancy is more in relation to some ideas, general ideas of string theory. And incidentally, Heidegger does touch physics, but says, well, we're talking about that somewhere else. But he is talking about space. He's talking about the paras in Greek, and other concepts which allow this space, some kind of generative and then individuation, probably in the Aristotelian sense of oros or orissimos, I think is how you pronounce it. So we'll go through and we'll find those words, but in a sense I'm linking back then to where we were thinking here. Because this takes place in language, but there is access to something which could be considered an exterior to language in Heidegger's text, in our questioning, and to sort of work through our own foregrounding and questions. We are committing to the work of critique in that we do our best to sort of see it through. I have made some comments about the cultural construct, that the cultural construct is cultural arguments, right, that might seem somewhat nationalistic or romantic. I'm sticking with that particular noting of a kind of potentially polemical element to the text, or the argument of the justification. So I'd also mentioned in terms of the Gewohnte, okay, the habitual, what we inhabit, and how the Gewohnte has something to do with dwelling and how that's accomplished. And of course this word bauen, and that Heidegger is concerned about dwelling falling into oblivion. And this is where we get a trace, and this trace has allows us to understand language, and its, let's say, constancy, at least to the point of where its constancy is allowing some kind of locale to be established, whereby space is created. And Heidegger elaborates about the kind of mental space or thinking of the bridge than just beyond its thingness there, connecting two pieces of land and its relation beyond that. Okay, so interesting is that we're starting from 353, but remember at 350, Heidegger puts three statements out. The first one is building is really dwelling. Dwelling is the manner in which mortals are on earth. Building as dwelling unfolds into the building that cultivates growing things and the building that erects buildings. Okay, so we had worked our way through the first, And we had come to page 353 toward the bottom. This is David Carell's basic writings for building dwelling thinking. And the question is, in what way does building belong to dwelling? It is a bit of a challenge, but it's worth it. So hopefully you have read this and perhaps have your own ideas about it, but I'll go ahead and go through with my reading. I will go through that with a bit of a premise. I'll preface that, I should say, by recalling that earth, sky, divinities, and mortals are the fourfold, right? And these are interconnected and interrelated for Heidegger. And that there's this kind of idea of care, idea of freeing, right, that's been put out there, and that there's this idea of a fourfold preservation, right? And that staying with things is the only way in which the fourfold stay within the fourfold is accomplished at any time in a simple unity, says Heidegger, right? So dwelling preserves this fourfold by bringing the essence of the fourfold into things, right? Dwelling brings it into things, continues Heidegger, but things themselves secure the fourfold only when they themselves as things are let to be in their essence. And he says, well, how does this happen? He says, in this way that mortals nurse and nurture the things that grow, and specially construct things that do not grow. Cultivating and construction are building in a narrower sense. Dwelling in as much as it keeps the fourfold in things is as is keeping a building. With this, we are on our way to the second question. So a building, right, has to do with dwelling as it keeps the fourfold in things. And that's what makes it a building. So dwelling in as much as it keeps the fourfold, right, earth, sky, divinities, and mortals, in things, a special attention to things, is as this keeping a building. That's how it becomes a building. Okay. And this is how he leads to his second question. So my preface. If we think about something like the four dimensions of geometry, right? Length, width, height, and then volume, right? Or then Euclidean geometry, right? We can think of a kind of in an analogous way, right? So philosophy has to sort of operate, whether or not philosophy operates as a consequence of this geometry, or Einstein, even in Einstein's non-Euclidean length, width, height, and time as ways to describe whatever. Which one goes first? I think the role of philosophy here, Heidegger's philosophy, is to say that this is how I'm explaining it to you. You can have whatever framing you like, but it's the philosopher who can describe this. And our purpose is culture and language and human society, right? So it's not perhaps the wisest thing to think of these as competing, but different descriptions. And in one way of a general agreement, right? That there is this kind of fourfold. String theory won't have the four, right? If you're familiar with string theory, it has something like 11, right? And if we just generally think about quantum mechanics, we know that from special relativity, time can slow down, right? But when it comes to the idea of what Michio Kaku calls multiverse, right? It can fork. Right, so forking of space and time then leads to these wormholes, which he says in a recent video. I've been a fan of his for a long. Even when he was on Art Bell, I was a fan of his way back in the day. But he said that you could get wormholes through Einstein's equations. But so it's not just a river of time as he describes it, right? The past can be altered But the question is, what past do you occupy? And this leads to copies, right? And a question of computation, right? Because computation, rather, in parallel universes gets a bit complicated, right? But he boils it down to two philosophies, and this has everything to do with where Heidegger arrives, in particular this word paras and horismos, right? Michio Kaku is talking about the two philosophies of the meaning of everything. So from Copernicus, right, the cosmological principle that we are nothing, we're just some piece of dust amongst an ocean of dust. And then the anthropic principle that says we are special, we have a life, that there's something meaningful for human beings. I would think that Heidegger fits in the anthropic principle, right? Because he's coming from this, at least more strongly from the anthropic principle, and not that we are nothing, right? So if we're going to look at this in really contemporary physics and how physics establishes itself from philosophy, then we can find that the cosmological, of course, is important to philosophy, but the anthropic principle is emphasized in the reading, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Essentially, that Michio Kaku is talking about, that the universe is made out of strings, that he derives his idea in the 70s. I think in 74 is when he writes the equation, from Pythagorean thought, right? Music. That aside, we're not going to go down there too far, but this idea of paras and Heidegger has everything to do with it, in my view, and it's interesting, right? But building dwelling thinking was first published in the early 70s, I believe, when it was actually being composed. I'm not sure, but what I'm doing is giving a sort of linear time frame here for how these ideas are developing in tandem, whether it's Michio Kaku or Heidegger, right? Describing some elements of space and time and all those other good things. So Heidegger emphasizes the anthropic, and this is in a general existentialist understanding, far beyond the sort of nihilistic framing, beyond the existentialistic one, into the absurdist one. You could almost say that string theory kind of has an absurdist vibe to it, in that if there is no overarching meaning to the universe, it does not mean that it's meaningless, right? Because there can even be a kind of positive nihilism in its prescriptive, maybe almost like an ideological form. But existentialism, has this different emphasis of once you overcome that, once you start affirming and saying yes, then it turns into something else. And absurdism is kind of an acceptance of this cosmological principle, but then also this sort of twist on the anthropic principle which existentialism brings forth. And that's why if we're going to do just a brief comparative between what a physicist like Michio Kaku thinks in the philosophical basis of string theory, then I think it's relevant that we emphasize the anthropic principle being protected here by Heidegger in a way. Okay, so back to the bottom of 353. In what way does building belong to dwelling? Some of this I'll just have to read because the prose is quite good. I like it, and it's quite interesting. We'll read this time a few pages more than we did last time. In what way does building belong to dwelling? The answer to this question will clarify for us what building understood by way of the essence of dwelling really is, right? He's saying that we limit ourselves to building in the sense of constructing things, and that we ask, what is a built thing? And a bridge is his example. He says a bridge may serve as an example for our reflections. And I think that's important, for our reflections, right, in conscious thought. So we'll get to the limit of this, what becomes a reflection. He'll talk about that, about the old Heidegger bridge. So he says, the bridge swings over the stream with ease and power, which is in quotes. It does not just connect banks that are already there. The banks emerge as banks only as the bridge crosses the stream. The bridge expressly causes them to lie across from each other. One side is set off against the other by the bridge, nor do the banks stretch along the stream as in different border strips of the dry land. With the banks, the bridge brings to the stream the one and the other expanse of the landscape lying behind them. It brings stream and bank and land into each other's neighborhood. The bridge gathers the earth as landscape around the stream. Thus it guides and extends the stream through the meadows. Resting upright in the stream's bed, the bridge piers bear the swing of the arches that leave the stream's waters to run their course. The waters may wander unquiet and gay. The sky's flood from storm or thaw may shoot past the piers in torrential waves. The bridge is ready for the sky's weather and its fickle nature. Even where the bridge covers the stream, it holds its flow up to the sky by taking it for a moment under the vaulted gateway and then setting it free once more. What a description. But what Heidegger is doing by illustration is how this bridge is connecting, right? And in the general sense, connecting earth, sky, divinities, and mortals. But he has to go back to its generative source, right? So the bridge, even in a type of ecological thinking, right? The bridge is also part of this ecology, in a way, right? In the sense of the locale can maybe be thought of as a type of technological, biological, non-biological connection, or a type of, in a way, it could be a trace figure. In a way, it could be, it's a difficult one, because the abridgment of the bridge, right? If we're going to go back and play with this abridgment which allows things to be stopped or impeded or separated, right? In order for it to actually be constituted in the world. It's quite an interesting illustration, which is why I find it such a strong moment in this text. Does the bridge extend or shorten, right? Does the bridge extend or shorten space and time, right? Who knows? Who knows, right? A bridge makes life easier, I suppose, in a very practical way. But it connects things, it brings things together, it makes passages possible. It's a linkage, right? And the bridge is also part of this fourfoldness, right? As described earlier, right? Dwelling keeps the fourfold in things, is as is keeping a building, right? And in this way, does the bridge have, does the bridge dwell, right? Because I've imposed this kind of panpsychic thing. I'm asking, what is the consciousness of the substance of this bridge, right? That's where I was trying to work through earlier. Let's see. The bridge lets the stream run its course and at the same time grants mortals their way, so that they may come and go from shore to shore. Bridges initiate in many ways. I'm in the middle of 354. The city bridge leads from the precincts of the castle to the cathedral square. The river bridge near the county town brings wagons and horse teams to the surrounding villages. The old stone bridge's humble brook crossing gives to the harvest wagon its passage from the fields into the village and carries the lumber cart from the field path to the road. The highway bridge is tied into the network of long-distance traffic, paced and calculated for maximum yield. Always and ever differently, the bridge initiates the lingering and hastening ways of men to and fro, so that they may get to other banks, and in the end, as mortals, to the other side. Now in a high arch, now in a low, the bridge vaults over a glen and stream, whether mortals keep in mind this vaulting of the bridge's course or forget it that day, always themselves on the way to the last bridge, are actually striving to surmount all that is common and unsound in them in order to bring themselves before the haleness of the divinities. The bridge gathers as a passage that crosses before the divinities, whether we explicitly think of and visibly give thanks for their presence, as in the figure of the saint of the bridge, or whether that divine presence is obstructed or even pushed wholly aside. The bridge gathers to itself in its own way earth and sky, divinities and mortals. So now it's gathering. What a strange paragraph. I'm on 355. I suggest, to really examine this text, this particular part. The bridge is doing something. It's participating in the activities, right? But these are activities of the fourfold. And the bridge is gathering into itself in its own way earth and sky, divinities and mortals. And now he goes back into the cultural situating of gathering. Rasamalung, by an ancient word of our language, is called thing. The bridge is a thing, and indeed it is such as the gathering of the fourfold, which we have described. To be sure, people think of the bridge as primarily and properly merely a bridge. After that, and occasionally it might possibly express much else besides. And as such an expression, it would then become a symbol, for instance, a symbol in those things we have mentioned before. But the bridge, if it is a true bridge, is never first of all a mere bridge and then afterward a symbol. And just as little is the bridge in the first place exclusively a symbol in the sense that it expresses something that, strictly speaking, does not belong to it. If we take the bridge strictly as such, it never appears as an expression. The bridge is a thing, and only that, only as this thing gathers the fourfold. So the bridge is gaining in a way, right? But this essence of the fourfold is at work here, right? It's not just a bridge, right? It's not just a bridge. It's not just a symbol, right? It has meaning. It expresses something. In the interlude, I talked about poetics. The poetics and poetry are different, right? Poetics is always this relational space that is irreconcilable. In a way, the bridge is the passage between two things, right? With a kind of abridgment, right? Do we ever really think when we're crossing some kind of bridge, right? Do we ever think on the bridge as bridge, right? This is what Heidegger's getting at. In a way, it's also this sort of mediative point between immediate and concept, right? Establishing that I just crossed the bridge. I am crossing the bridge is different than where one is going in the sense of targeting a destination. He then goes on to say, look, we understate the essence of the thing, right? And there's a consequence in Western thought. And the consequence is that the thing is represented as an unknown X to which perceptible properties are attached. From this point of view, everything that already belongs to the gathering essence of this thing does, of course, appear as something that is afterward read into it. Yet the bridge would never be a mere bridge if it were not a thing. I think this is important. When we take something like data or numbers which represent things like opinion or the number of trees in a wood or the woods and all of the trees in the woods, we put that on a spreadsheet or as data. right? I think we can read this kind of understanding of what it means to dwell, what it means to be with things. There's an expression there that really exceeds this reduction, right? When we understate the essence of the thing, right? We understate it in that way. And now we have data which might express itself, or we might think it's expressing, right? Computers, machinery, streaming, videos, whatever, right? I find it kind of interesting. And I think this is some of the best of Heidegger's takeaways, is that he does enable us a way through his own rigorous understanding of things, really in the phenomenological type of mode, with the question of the anthropic, the special thing that we have as anthropic, as guided by an anthropic principle, right? That because it is a thing, the bridge is a thing of its own kind, right? As he continues, bottom of 355. To be sure, the bridge is a thing of its own kind, for it gathers a fourfold in such a way that it allows a site for it. But only something that is itself a locale can make space for a site. The locale is not already there before the bridge is. This is important because a locale, in probably this kind of ecological framing in a very general way, right? The locale is established afterward, right? So this kind of dwelling in the locale, right, is important to note. Top of 356. Before the bridge stands, there are, of course, many spots along the stream that can be occupied by something. One of them proves to be a locale and does so because of the bridge. Thus, the bridge does not first come to a locale to stand in it. Rather, a locale comes into existence only by virtue of the bridge. The bridge is a thing. It gathers a fourfold, but in such a way that it allows a site for the fourfold. It allows a site for the fourfold. So the fourfold cannot become a thing. You see the interdependence here. It can't really be a thing that expresses, from which we are losing sight of. It cannot become this thing that expresses, right? It cannot do that. It cannot be legible, I suppose, in a way. It cannot come to our awareness where we reflect, consciously reflect on the bridge, right? The locale does not first come to, the bridge does not first come to a locale to stand in it. Rather, a locale comes into existence only by virtue of the bridge. The bridge is a thing. It gathers a fourfold, but in such a way that it allows a site for the fourfold. A site for the fourfold in consciousness. By this site are determined the places and paths by which a space is provided for. So space is provided for through this relationship between the thing, the locale, and the gathering, right? The thing gathers a fourfold, there's a site for the fourfold, right? And then a space is constituted in this way. Let's see if we got it right. Only things that are locales in this manner allow for spaces. Okay, so it's important to understand what he means by this manner. Nonetheless, he goes back into the German language and the word for space, Raum. Raum designates, is said by its ancient meaning, means a place that is freed for settlement and lodging. A space is something that has been made room for, something that has been freed, namely within a boundary. And this is where it gets interesting. He's noting the word now, the Greek word peros. A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognize, the boundary is that from which something begins its essential unfolding. So something begins its essential unfolding. Well, what is this word peros? It essentially means a limit, right? And I'm referring to F.E. Peters' Greek philosophical terms. Great book, published in the 50s. Anybody who studies philosophy should have one of these. It's an amazing book. I love it. Okay, so in Peters defines it like this: through the notion, or though the notion of limit is obviously an ingredient in Anaxamander's Empyrean, or absence of an internal determination questions, it begins to play a formal role among the Pythagoreans, for whom, on Aristotle's testimony, it was, together with the unlimited, an ultimate principle of reality, standing behind even number. Limit stands at the head of one of the Pythagorean tables of opposites from the Nietzschean ethics and metaphysics, and is explicitly connected with the good. The Pythagorean paros may be related to their discovery of numerical proportions in musical harmony. Such seems to be the intent of Plato's use of paros for its ethical implications, etc., etc. Okay, so Peters is telling us that the history of this word, this concept, it is even before number, right? So it stands behind number. It's the notion of the limit, but a limit for what? It actually starts to play. It shows up earlier, but then it really gets important for Pythagoras, who is very important to, of course, Michio Kaku, of course, the idea of quantum mechanics and string theory, and Heidegger's talking about this limit, right? And its relationship to music, which stands behind number. And this is, in a way, how we're working into understanding, perhaps in a very provisional way, quantum mechanics in Heidegger's text, and even by extension, right? We would have to really do a lot of work here, and maybe some have published work like this, I'm not sure. But by extension, technology and quantum computing, and how quantum computing is behind numbers, right? Behind the 1-0, behind all the formalistic algorithms, natural language processing, neural networks, all of those things, which comprises technic, right? So Heidegger is saying, look, we need to pay attention to the thing expresses something important. And this bridge is a thing. And the bridge, before the bridge stands, there are many spots along the stream that can be occupied by something. One of them proves to be a locale. So the locale kind of comes into the bridge in a way. But the locale is emergent because of the bridge. The bridge is in some way special, right? The bridge does not first come to a locale to stand in it. Rather, a locale comes into existence only by virtue of the bridge. The bridge is a thing. It gathers the fourfold, but in such a way that it allows a site for the fourfold, for consciousness, for reflection, for thought. By this site are determined the places and paths by which a space is provided for. So now the unfolding, right? So if I wanted to work on this consciousness and exterior to language, this would, I think, challenge or complicate this idea of how a space is constituted, or how there are other spaces, or a multiverse, for instance. We will not make an extended comparative effort in this reading, but we will continue on. And he states, right, that things in, I'm on 356, recapping a bit, only things that are locales in this manner allow for spaces. Talks about realm, and realm means that a place is freed for settlement and lodging. He gets to this idea of a space is something that has been made room for, something that has been freed, namely within a boundary. Greek paras. A boundary is not that at which something stops, but as the Greeks recognize, the boundary is that from which something begins its essential unfolding. That is why the concept is that of horismos. I think I called it horismos. Oops. I'm from America. What can you say? That is why the concept is that of horismos, that is the horizon, the boundary. Okay, so again, a recap here. Paras is the limit, that which even stands behind numbers, right? But it doesn't stop at this boundary. There is an essential unfolding, horismos, horos for Aristotle, right? Which also is a kind of individuation of that which is at this limit, right? This limit might be, in some sense, an abridgment, right? A shortening of time, or a way to rethink the breach between time and being, right? At any rate, space is in essence that for which room has been made, that which is let into its bounds. That for which room is made is always granted and hence is joined. That is gathered by virtue of a locale. That is by such a thing as the bridge. Accordingly, spaces receive their essential being from locales and not from space. So space is in some sense consequential. Locales are sort of ready, but a thing actually brings this locale, right? And the thing is gathering the fourfold and then establishes its kind of in space, establishes itself, right? So we're moving from this kind of feeling into the concept of a locale, an area, and this interrelatedness of all of which is because of the bridge, the specialness of the bridge. Okay. Continuing on. Thing at the bottom of 356. Things which as locales allow a sight we now in anticipation call buildings. So this is how we get to buildings. So listen again if you want, read it for yourself, because the question is, how does building belong to dwelling? Right, so dwelling in as much as it keeps the fourfold in things is as is keeping a building, right? So in what way does building belong to dwelling? As we began on the bottom of 353, now, right, things which as locales allow a sight we now in anticipation call buildings. So without this locale, we don't really have a buildings. They are so called because they are made by a process of building construction. Of what sort this making building must be, however, we find out only after we have first given thought to the essence of those things that of themselves require building as the process by which they are made. These things are locales that allow a sight for the fourfold, a sight that in each case provides for a space. The relation between locale and space lies in the essence of these things as locales, but so does the relation of locale to the man who lives there. Now we're getting into a kind of poetical relation, right? Because this poetical relation is premised on paros, on the limit, and the horismos, which is individuation in Aristotelian thinking. And because this permeation has been allowed to where the immeasurable, irreconcilable has been pierced and is unfolded and is given sort of definition to the thing, is gathered up the fourfold and is now constituted in the specialness of this bridge, its essence, right, that we take for granted. Now we have a space, right, and we have a building, right, because it has some kind of anthropic importance. It's special. We give it that specialness, right? We give it that specialness. So what's Heidegger's task now? He says the relation between locale and space lies in the essence of these things as locales, but so does the relation of the locale to the man who lives there. Therefore, we shall now try to clarify the essence of these things that we call buildings by the following brief consideration. Okay, what is this consideration? 357 top. For one thing, what is the relation between locale and space? For another, what is the relation between man and space? The bridge is a locale, he says. As such a thing, it allows space into which earth and sky, divinities and mortals are admitted. The space allowed by the bridge contains many places variously near or far from the bridge. These places, however, may be treated as mere positions between which there lies a measurable distance. And this is stadion in Greek, which is not in Peter's text, but we'll take Heidegger's word for it. This stadion means always to have room made for it, and indeed by bare positions. I'll read the sentence again. These places, however, may be treated as mere positions between which there lies a measurable distance. A distance in Greek, stadion, always has room made for it, and indeed by bare positions. The space that is thus made by positions is space of a peculiar sort, right? Again, so fixed antinomies in a way that are recognizable, right? No longer being deferred, right? There is a distance, there is a vibration between this distance, let's say. There is a relation between these 2 points, which is in a way, a wave of relation, a relational correspondence, right? This is, in the Pythagorean imprint here is important to note. That's what I'm working at here. The space that is thus made by positions in space of a peculiar sort, right? Bare positions, the space that is thus made by positions is a space of a peculiar sort. And it needs room to be expressing at this very base level. Okay. So if they may be treated as mere positions between which there lies a measurable distance, a distance in Greek, stadion, always has room made for it, and indeed by bare positions, the space that is thus made by positions is space of a peculiar sort, as distance or stadion. It is what the same word stadion means in Latin, a space, spatium, an intervening space or interval, an intervening space or interval. Thus, nearness and remoteness between men and things can become mere distance, mere intervals of intervening space. In a space that is represented purely as spatium, the bridge now appears as a mere something at some position, which can be occupied at any time by something else or replaced by a mere marker. What is more, the mere dimensions of height, breadth, and depth can be abstracted from space as intervals. What is so abstracted we represent as the pure manifold of the 3 dimensions. Yet, the room made by this manifold is also no longer determined by distances. It is no longer a spatium, but now no more than extension or extensio. But from space as extensio, a further abstraction can be made. To analytic algebraic relations, what these relations make room for is the possibility of the purely mathematical construction of manifolds with an arbitrary number of dimensions. The space provided for in this mathematical manner may be called space, the one, space as such. And indeed, this is working within the Greek terms as well, for the idea of the oros in particular. Nonetheless, the space provided for in this mathematical manner may be called the space, the one, which is in quotes, space as such. But in this sense, the space in quotes, contains no spaces and no places. We never find it in any locales, that is, things of the kind the bridge is. Now that's really, really interesting. There's a space which contains no spaces and no places. Maybe I just don't know enough, okay, about mathematics here. But how does that come to be? Why is there a parallel to the space? Why is it that we never find in it any locales that is things of the kind the bridge is? Maybe it's not a type of multiverse. Maybe it's not going back in time and recreating the bridge and instantly changing history and creating only a copy and occupying that particular component of reality. As against that, however, continues Heidegger, in the spaces provided for by locales, there is always space as interval, And in this interval, in turn, there is space as pure extension. He's talking about right there, that bridge in its special essence. You can have a mental space, perhaps. Spatium and extensio afford at any time the possibility of measuring things in what they make room for according to distances, spans, and directions, and of computing these magnitudes. But the fact that they are universally applicable to everything that has extension can in no case make numerical magnitudes the ground of the essence of spaces and locales that are measurable with the aid of mathematics. The ground, important here, right? How even modern physics was compelled by the facts themselves to represent the spatial medium of cosmic space as a field unity determined by body as dynamic center cannot be discussed here. So body as dynamic center, we're not going to discuss it. I think it would be an interesting place to explore. We just don't have we could keep going into this and work it out rigorously. This happens in scholarship. We're pursuing questions. We're checking our foreground. My question is developing on this exterior to language. My question is thinking about consciousness before permeating and extending beyond language, like being accessible, and this idea of abridgments as well, condensing, moving to different intensive, perhaps, existences in one sense in one universe, but perhaps parallel universes, right? That this paras, it might be very furtive to explore in terms of even contemporary physics, a string theory of the type of Michio Kaku's level, right? Because in one way, Heidegger is, in some sense, describing a fork. In the bottom of 357 to 358, I find it really interesting, analogous in a way. There is this mathematical space, but in this sense, it doesn't contain any space or place, right? Well, you're not occupying it, but there is a copy made, right? There is a copy made, right? And he says it's against that in the spaces provided for by locales, like here and now, there is always space as interval, and in this interval, in turn, there is space as pure extension. Interesting. I would have to read deeper here, and trust me, I want to go down the rabbit hole, but I wanted to make this palatable. Okay. 358, second paragraph. The spaces through which we go daily are provided for by locales. So he's really saying, look, we're special. We have these locales. We give it meaning, right? Human beings, we should be wary of technology, what it does to our thinking. Technology has this special thing. It helps us establish locales. Locales allow the thing to express, right? And we can have copies of these spaces, but it's not like the here and now, right? So these spaces we go through, right, daily, are provided for by locales. Locales are intensively important for when we get out of the more abstract thinking, the ecological sort of relationship between technology and biotic things, right? Or, you know, what's the locale established by a virus, right? That would be an interesting one to think in the Heideggerian terms. How are locales interlinked to other locales, right? Is this a kind of gridded? Oh, is this a kind of grid of intervals, right? Of intensive intervals that are only in the here and now, intensively important to human beings, right? How is this interval, right? A really important word. This mediation, this bridging experience between the immediate and the concept, between the how did he put it? The bare positions and the spaces that are denoted, that draw lines or waves between points, right? That all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the wave between these points, these two places of a bridge, right, can be drawn together, can be closed up in a way, and then expand through this paras, through this limit behind numbers, right, through the individuation of what comes out of the limit. The individuation is situated upon numbers to describe them, which can in some way describe another space, right? But it's not a space as the here and now. So there is this withdrawal in language that he talks about, the withdrawal of the divine, right? And then we get right back to this, we've forgotten the essence, right? And dwelling is really important. This is why buildings are situated as a consequence of dwelling, but are of course related, right? So they're tied together, right? So the spaces through which we go daily are provided for by locales. So this is a situating to say that, let's just think of this in terms of locales now, in a way, right? They're provided for by, the spaces through which we go daily are provided for by locales. So in order to have these spaces, we first must have locales. In order to have locales, we have to have things, but the things are made legible by the locales, right? The essence of the locale is grounded in things of the type of buildings, says Heidegger. If we pay heed to these relations between locales and spaces, between spaces and space, we get a clue to help us in thinking of the relation of man and space. Okay, so like this. The essence of locales is grounded in things of the type of buildings, bridge. If we pay heed to these relations between locales and spaces, okay, remember, the locale provides for the space, that has a relation there. If we also consider the relation between spaces and space, we get a clue to help us in thinking of the relation of man and space. So our anthropic practices are informed by that. Again, the spaces through which we go daily are provided for by locales. Their essence, the essence of the locale, is grounded in the things of the type of buildings. If we pay heed to these relations between locales and spaces, between spaces and space, we get a clue to help us in thinking of the relation of man and space. When we speak of man and space, it sounds as though man stood on one side, space on the other. Yet space is not something that faces man. It is neither an external object nor an inner experience. Interesting. Well, what's an inner experience? Anyway, tangent. We'll note that. Space is not an external object nor an inner experience. I don't know about that. Interesting. I just provisionally agree here. It is not that there are men and over and above them space. For when I say a man, and in saying this word think of a being who exists in a human manner, that is, who dwells, then by the name man, I already name the stay within the fourfold among things. Huh? Oh, yes, because fourfold, yes, mortals. Even when we relate ourselves to those things that are not in our immediate reach, we are staying with the things themselves. Okay. We do not represent distant things merely in our mind, as the textbooks have it, so that only mental representations of distant things run through our minds and heads as substitutes for the things, right? Again, this is back on the here and now. But let's pause here for a moment, because he's going to talk about the old bridge in Heidelberg, which is what he was describing earlier, by the way. Seems certainly a technique that he uses in the origin of the work of art, etc. But let's look at this again. We do not represent distant things merely in our mind. We do not represent distant things merely in our mind. So that only mental representations of distant things run through our minds and heads as substitutes for the thing, right? We imagine them, don't we? Heidegger's not talking about imagination, but we also imagine them. We become aware of them. But even as what is perturbing into awareness, right, is feeling, right? And feeling, analogously in Heidegger, then, is this specialness, right? Our part in the fourfold, right? Human imagination is a name for generative consciousness, right? Special consciousness. And in Heidegger, it's operating here in my reading. Okay. If you're more interested in the imagination and the principle, according to, the poetry of thought, check out the interlude. If all of us now think from where we are right here of the old bridge in Heidelberg, this thinking toward that locale is not mere experience inside the person's present here. Rather, it belongs to the essence of our thinking of that bridge that in itself thinking persists through, durchsteht, the distance to that locale. From this spot right here, we are there at the bridge. We are by no means at some representational content in our consciousness. From right here, we may even be much nearer to that bridge and to what it makes room for than someone who uses it daily as an indifferent river crossing. Top of 359. Some people are just on the bridge and they're not even thinking about it. So they're somewhere else, closer to that place than which they already are, right? But we could be even closer to that bridge than you think, even if we're not there. Interesting, right? And I can't help myself but to think of Heraclitus here and stepping into the river. No one steps in the same river twice, I think is the phrase. And that we have a bridge, a Pythagorean bridge over the Heraclitus River, right? It's this bridge comes up into our consciousness, even though we're right here, we are there, right? And this is a really, really intensive moment. I'm on the bottom of 358 again. This is a really intensive moment where there are multiple spots that we are at. They're legible spots in reality, I would say. And it's my interpretation. In time. In space, it can be legible to consciousness in our system of knowledge, which is, type 0 civilization, very low level. But we begin to understand our disbursement through the mind. This is the mind and the imagination holding this up as well, right? It is for me, a special experience of consciousness to be able to write like this and to think of it. And it belongs to a poetic relation, right, of the abstract and of the mental, right? Again, I want to read through this bottom of the page. If all of us now think from where we are right here of the old bridge in Heidelberg, this thinking toward that locale is not a mere experience inside the person's present here. Rather, in itself, thinking persists through the distance to that locale. Thinking persists through the distance to that locale. What kind of thinking is this? Is this of the intelligence? What provides this? Is it an abridgment? Why can I be in another place, right? Why can I be in another place? More so if I'm not there, right? When you're talking to someone and you can just see they're vacantly not there. They're thinking about something else. Don't take it as an insult. Just ask them if they've ever read page 358 of Building Dwelling Thinking, right? Again, the old bridge in Heidelberg, right? It's not, this thinking toward that locale is not a mere experience inside the person's present here. Rather, it belongs to the essence of our thinking of that bridge that in itself thinking persists through. Thinking, consciousness, the intelligence, whatever. From this spot right here, we are there at the bridge. We are by no means at some representational content in our consciousness. From right here, we may even be much nearer to that bridge and to what it makes room for than someone who uses it daily as an indifferent river crossing. Spaces, and with them space as such, space in quotes, are always provided for already within the stay of mortals. Spaces open up by the fact that they are let into the dwelling of man. To say that mortals are is to say that indwelling, they persist through spaces by virtue of their stay among things and locales. And only because mortals pervade, which is preface, the Latin, is it related to paras? I would have to look that up. That they pervade. Only because mortals pervade, persist through spaces by their very essence are they able to go through spaces. But in going through spaces, we do not give up our standing in them. Rather, we always go through spaces in such a way that we are already sustained by them by staying constantly with near and remote locales and things. When I go toward the door of the lecture hall, I am already there, and I could not go to it at all if I were not such that I am there. I'm never here only as this encapsulated body. Rather, I am there, that is, I already pervade the space of the room, and only thus can I go through it. Okay, moving on. Even when mortals turn inward and taking stock of themselves, they do not leave behind their belonging to the fourfold. Okay, when, as we say, we come to our senses and reflect on ourselves, we come back to ourselves from things without ever abandoning our stay among things. So we're still with these things. Because things have a very deep, profound role in Heidegger's ontological description here. We have a stay among things. I think it's very good. Indeed, the loss of rapport with things that occurs in states of depression would be wholly impossible if even such a state were not still what it is as a human state, that is, a staying with things. Heidegger is familiar with depression, right? Only if this state already characterizes human being can the things among which we are also fail to speak to us, fail to concern us any longer. Okay, almost done here for this video. Man's relation to locales and through locales to spaces inheres in his dwelling. Right? Inheres in his dwelling. What does he mean by that? It's inherent or vested or permanent in a way, right? It's infinite in a way. I'm going to say there's an infinite notion here. And this word inheres, I think, is important. I don't know what the German word for that is, what was used, but it would be interesting to know. But I'm going to take it to mean this. Man's relation to locales, I'm at the bottom of 359. Man's relation to locales and through locales to spaces inheres in his dwelling. So we're going backwards now. We went from the thing up. We went from the paras up to the thing to the locale. Now we're going backwards. Man's relation to locales and through locales to spaces inheres in his dwelling. The relationship between man and space is none other than dwelling thought, essentially. So in his dwelling is this sort of infinite relation. We're always among, we don't ever abandon our stay among things. This is a kind of infinite, to me, this is not finitude at all. It's just not. I mean, what guarantees this sort of, without ever abandoning our stay among things, right? When we think in the manner just attempted about the relation between locale and space, but also about the relation of man and space, a light falls on the essence of the things that are locales and that we call buildings. Okay, the things that are locales, right? Because locales make the thing legible, right? It's special, and that's the only way that it can be a building. So now when we're thinking about this inherent relation between man, human being, and locales, between locale and space, between our human relation and space, there's a light that falls on the essence of things that are locales that we call buildings. What is this light? Next, 360. The bridge is a thing of this sort. It's the bridge. Okay. The locale allows the simple one-fold of earth and sky, of divinities and mortals, to enter into a sight by arranging the sight into spaces. The locale makes room for the fourfold in a double sense. The locale admits the fourfold and it installs the fourfold. The two, making room in the sense of admitting and in the sense of installing, belong together. As a double space making, the locale is a shelter for the fourfold or, by the same token, house. Things such as locales shelter or house humans' lives. Things of this sort are housings, though not necessarily dwelling houses in a narrower sense. So this housing of this inherent relation. In a way, you get the sense that Heidegger is philosophizing a kind of experience of the poet, is establishing the passages of poetry, right? The relational capacity of poetry, the storing of and guarding of, right, one's appearance in the world in its multiple different places. We talk a lot about, and it does seem, it's my reflection time. It does seem we live in this moment where privacy has been completely annihilated, right? Nothing's private. You can have your VPN and dark web or whatever, but fewer and fewer are off the grid. Everything's getting turned into this symbol, represented as data, followed around, tracked, digested, retransformed, processed into some kind of data. And does it point to that other place where we're staying, right, among things? Is it even close to our stay among things in the Heideggerian concept, which is the experience of perhaps a poet's different points in the world, that in the Pessoan sense, these sources of dialogue that he has with other of his heteronyms, right, of his other poets and personas, right? That's me, but that's a copy of me, so I'll give him a different name, right? There is this kind of disbursement. And the funny thing is, right, if we have a stay among things, I find it fascinating that this is informed by an intelligence that permeates, right, through the peras and is individuated, right, in the Horis, how did I pronounce it? I don't want to pronounce it wrong again. Horismos, right? But you get this. I really appreciate the way that the locale, the space, the thing are engendering one another through a generative moment of a permeation, right, between two places. It's not only a really wonderful illustration, it demands a lot out of the reader, okay? But the illustration almost stands strong enough to sort of pass that feeling on to you. As I had mentioned, as I started this reading, I will never forget the bridge and the locale and how this sort of unfolds and works. It's I get older and I accumulate more knowledge, that the illustration impresses me. And as we continue to work and read with the text or learn with the text, as I have shown in my approach to part 3 here, let me bring something in from physics, right? From string theory, from Michio Kaku. Let me bring in some kind of framing to question and to see to what extent the text is linked to the contemporary, right? This is the difference between a classic and a non-classic text, that it continues to become legible to history, the unfolding of history, by the strength of its insight, right? That it's working with these ideas of Pythagoras, of intervals, of a kind of music between points, and a kind of relation between locales, right? And our experience of the infinite as a mortal, which is a finitude that we live in, but an infinite there notion, which for me, I'm not going to say this one life is it. There has to be more, right? I guess that's the happy thing. But to take this away, locale is an intensively important thing for thinking about, in the ecological sense, the relationship between technology, biotic things, right? And how they co-constitute or work together, right? That dwelling is what that dwelling comes before building, right? But that dwelling is installed in a way in all kinds of things, and that's what makes it a building. At any rate, probably good to stop here. And as I conclude this reading, I will start the final one next week and recap this, and we will get through the next. There's only about 4 pages.